to Inquiring Minds, the Writing and Literacy SIG podcast. My name is Sarah Drossa, and I am one of the graduate student board members and the host for today's episode. The Writing and Literacy SIG podcast aims to highlight scholarship, discuss contemporary issues, and engage in conversation with SIG members and the greater writing and literacies field. Through engaging in dialogue, we hope to ignite nationwide discussions amongst faculty and graduate students concerning topics that are timely and pertinent to the scholarship concerning the relationship between writing, literacies, and the broader field of education. Today's episode will be centered on the topic of digital literacies and how our panelists see digital literacies, multimodalities, and technology spaces shaping the field of literacy, as well as where digital literacies might be headed in the future. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a few minutes for introductions. We would love for each of our scholars to introduce themselves, let us know their affiliate institutions, and their current research focus. So we can begin with Dr. Amy Hutchison.
Hi there, Amy Hutchison. I'm the Fayard Family Professor of Literacy at the University of Alabama. Newly just moved here from George Mason University. And I am currently actually focusing a lot on digital writing, learning to compose digital compositions, specifically through a platform my team has developed called Compose and Code, which helps students learn to create written compositions and turn them into multimodal compositions through coding. So that's it in a nutshell.
Is Brady Nash, and I'm an assistant professor of English language arts at Miami University, the one in Ohio, not in Florida. And my current research focus is on digital literacies in secondary English courses, specifically digital reading and critical media literacy, thinking about how curriculum that address those topics can be more responsive to students' cultures, students' funds of knowledge, and also more responsive to what's going on with digital reading and how people are making sense of the world on social media platforms and all of the wild stuff that's happening there.
Rabani, I am a fourth-year doctoral student at Reading, Writing, Literacy at University of Pennsylvania, the Graduate School of Education. I work with Dr. Amy Stoneyolo, and I research youth practices and participation on digital media networks through ethnographic and multimodal methods. And my dissertation project examines literacy practices of youth in youth-led coalitions outside the school in both Delhi, where I'm from, and Philadelphia, where I'm living right now, to really look at what collective literacy practices, what are the collective literacy practices of youth in these spaces, and how these develop over time and in relation to other digital and physical spaces. Also looking at how these intersect with global and local network discourses.
Good morning, everybody, or whatever time it is when you're hearing this. My name is Antero Garcia. I'm an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. I've been thinking a lot about speculative approaches to learning and literacy. This has to do with some of the digital literacy background that I tend to engage with this work. So trying to imagine kind of what are the horizons of the work that we're on is my colleague Nicole Mira, who I've been doing a lot of this work with. We've been thinking about this in terms of horizons and the boundaries of where educational and equity-driven research might live. I'm also finishing the page proofs for a book the next couple of days on the school bus, and making an argument that the school bus is the most substantive form of educational technology. And so I've been thinking about that as we've been interested in thinking about what digital tools look like. I would argue that the school bus is probably the biggest form of educational technology that's shaped U.S. education.
Nice. We're so excited to have all of you here for this conversation. So to begin, our first question to really kind of guide our conversation is, how do you see digital literacies and multimodalities taking shape right now within the literacy field?
I think a lot in my work about how like writing and using technologies is not binary and should not be thought about that way. We're always using all these mediums simultaneously, collectively, and I think that's a really important piece of what we should be thinking about and teaching students. Actually, if you look behind me right now, I have a 3D printer, I have a Post-it note on my wall, I have a marker board, I have books, I have robotic blocks. I use all of these things together. So that's something I think about a lot, and how we should be shaping how we think about this. And I think, like, as digital composers, well, and if I think about how I'm doing this in my adult life, which is, where we ultimately are preparing students to what we're ultimately preparing them to do, we're always collecting information and having to filter and organize and curate. And I think that's a really also important piece of the writing process that's just as important as just like the actual composing itself. So I do think that's a critical piece of things. I also think that kind of maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there was the shift to this idea that students should not just be consumers of information, but creators of information. And I would say, like, I think the current shift is that not just creators of information with existing applications, but they should actually be creators of the applications themselves that they can use to create things. And they can learn to do that by learning programming. So that's why I focus on programming as a form of writing. And sort of within that, something I hope all students take away is developing, I sort of focus on these 3 key pieces of like the critical, functional, and rhetorical literacies that are needed for that medium, but also like how you use those same literacies across mediums.
To add to what you were saying and thinking of students as creators of media, in my work with youth in India, something that I've been noticing, which again, I'm not the first one to notice it. We've seen that across. There are a lot of young people's literacy practices, whether it's in media making, creating things, increasingly intersect with these larger global discourses that exist around. An example of this was I have a student who's now a senior, who's now a junior at college. He during the Black Lives Matter movement in Delhi, he created these beautiful, very powerful collages, and he was this person sitting in Delhi, but engaging with content, things that were happening in a very different context. So I've been thinking a lot about how young people's media practices really sit within these larger discourses. And I'm thinking about a way to bring that in, or for me, I guess, as a doctoral student to study it. So that's something that I'm very fascinated with.
I've been thinking a lot about, maybe worrying a lot about the sort of socio-political realm that we are in right now, and thinking about the implications of that for literacy curriculum in schools and what it means to teach for justice and for democracy. And the kinds of things that I think that we all in this space right now, or at least on this Zoom, believe in a world that's becoming increasingly unfriendly to those ideas. And yeah, just thinking about like what is the role of digital literacies in these spaces? There's a little interchange between 2 teachers I was working with last year, where one says, I wonder what in 50 years or so, when people look back at our time and say, in those early days of the internet, like what were they using these technologies for? And the other teacher says they were using them to destroy the free world. And I think while we might have debates about like how free the world was in the past, I think there's definitely some currents, some sort of like rising right-wing and fascist movements around the world, and thinking about what do digital literacies look like in this new space, where I think there's going to be a lot of shifts in how power is distributed in ways that we might not like.
Actually, where some of the critical and rhetorical literacies that I focus on and programming come in. Like, if you can learn to be a creator of those things, you can be more effective at shaping the conversation, because you can create the very tools that are used to uplift and oppress. So that's a lot of where I take my work as well.
Amy, I appreciate that that reminder that you just said. Great, that these tools are both, a hammer is a hammer, right? They can both uplift and oppress, to use your words, right? And I think this is where I think thinking about the bummer language, Brady, that you brought up, and Amy, I think the possibilities of the tools that we're thinking about. This is I think where I think like in the heart of those two comments is kind of where I've been sitting, feeling pretty pessimistic, I think, about the state of the world and the state of what our research can do, right? So my work with English ed teachers has been kind of thinking about how the ways we teach English in the US, English language arts, tends to might have been complicit in some of the rise of right-wing fascist practice, autocratic practices happening in this country right now. So for example, some of the things that we take for granted, I'll make it I'll make a digital connection in a second, but some of the things we take for granted, like the ways that argumentation and debate are centered in K-12 writing practices, might reflect the kind of sparring and argumentative ways that we kind of hold territory and fight kind of in this like political colonial approach, rather than thinking about what discourse and empathy and dialogue might look like. And so I think what I want to say about this is, as we think about the ways that we might be complicit as researchers, as educators, as people who are preparing teachers, I've been trying to think about what are the ways we might reimagine what our relationships with digital tools would be. And so one thing I would remind maybe folks listening to us, I don't want to remind us, it sounds very mansplaining, is when I think about digital literacies, I think about digits and I think about like our fingers, right? And reminder that the digital can be the things that we hold with our hands, right? That as we're talking, I've been writing on a notebook, and it's, no one can read it, even myself, right? Like I'm not sure what that physical act is doing for anybody, but the digital is always a simulation of the analog, right? It's always tied to what's happening in this world around us. We tend to talk as a field, as if the digital is this other space, right? And you're going somewhere else. But every time you go, quote unquote, on the internet, or you go onto a social media site, you're doing that in a physical space. I'm sitting in a cluttered office where if there's an earthquake, I'm dead for sure. Like this is not a safe environment. And so I can think about, the ways that this physical space shapes me, the ways that there's a cup of coffee next to me, the ways I'm worried that my dog is going to bark and ruin this recording, right? The analog space is always a part of us. And to your point, Brady, like that is also the socio-political nature of the analog space shaping the digital environments too.
Kind of thinking of a connection between what you all are saying too. There's a circular relationship where like the technological environments that are designed, like Amy, as you said, designed by our future students in the future, or I mean our current students in the future will be designing these, and those shape like what kind of political discourse we can have, and then the sort of socio-political discourse shapes what kinds of technologies develop. And so I think there's this really interesting relationship, kind of thinking like what Rabani was saying too, about like in these global spaces, there's like a lot going on that I think in our sort of argumentation oriented essay text ways of doing things in language arts we may have missed or worsened.
So I think this is so helpful for me to even sort of think through with you, because a lot of what you're speaking is what I'm looking at in my research. Dr. Garcia, you just brought up and I've read that paper. I've taught it in my digital literacy class about the sort of the analog being a part of our digital spaces. That's something that I've been really thinking about. I guess I'm in the field and I see it a lot more of like how I work in informal spaces. Most of my work has always been in museums or with art-based pedagogies, but increasingly how the space within which those artifacts are being produced, or the ways in which the young people I work with digital spaces. The space itself informs so much of what they're doing, whether it's creating like a TikTok video or a hip hop song, or a dance video. But so I think that's something that I would love to talk more about, sort of the ways in which we can engage in this scholarship, because most of the scholarship on digital literacy takes you away from it, like takes you away from the space. And of course, we're talking a lot about platforms and tools and applications, but circling right back to maybe even informal spaces, though I kind of hate to make the distinction.
Rabani, you're making me think about the fraught nature of the word informal, right? That in some space, every space is a learning space, whether or not we use formal or informal, right? That it's a weird distinction that is a state sanctioned distinction in some sense, right? Like that is an abdication of responsibilities in one space or another. And yeah, maybe the kinds of learning that happen based on a space, right? So like Amy, I'm looking at your 3D printer and the post-it notes behind it, right? And if that 3D printer, like if you unplugged it and moved it to like the student center right on campus, right, it would function in a different way than if you moved it to the zoo, right? I don't know what would happen at the zoo, right? Maybe it just becomes smelly, right? But you can just think about like the context, like really shapes, I think, to your point, Rabani, like the kind of work that happens with our digital tools.
It just moved from my house to my office. At my house with my 8-year-old daughter, it was used to print a teddy bear. And it was
Was it
Western.
cuddly? Can you make a soft teddy bear with the 3D printer?
Nope, it's a very hard bear-shaped object is maybe the better way to say it. That then became a necklace because that was the direction she wanted to take it. And of course, the last time it was used here was for very different purposes. So I could not agree more on that.
You know, the literacy field could probably do well with more hard bear-shaped objects, I think. That seemed like the real takeaway here.
You're actually making me think about, this is taking the conversation in a different direction, but like how differently different students think about, interact with, and show interest and engagement with different technologies. This has really bothered me for a long time. I think there's this assumption that if you're under a certain age that you love technology and live and die by it and want to use it for all things. And I know we've talked about this a lot in the field, but like I feel like I'm living and breathing it right now. I have 3 school-age children. I have an 8-year-old who's just incredibly creative and smart and has zero interest in any technologies unless they can print her a bear. And I think for a long time there's been this sort of emphasis on, especially with girls, like we have to get girls more engaged in STEM-like activities, and especially like enjoying technologies and, you know, developing literacies around technologies. And I certainly do agree that there's reason to expose them to those things and like provide those opportunities and certainly teach them the functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies around them. But I also don't think like we should continue to make the assumption that everyone loves working with technology, that this is the best way to do things and teach things. It's just not that black and white. And so I think that's important. By contrast, my 11-year-old daughter, like obsessively builds and programs Legos, right? And they're just 2 totally different kids who've grown up in exactly the same environment, who just are very different people because people are different. And so I think that's like also an interesting thing to think about. Not all of our students are going to be interested in learning like in the socio-political context of things, right? Like I'm just using that as an example because it's come up in this conversation. They're all going to have different interests. And I do think that like we have to really consider that in everything we create and study.
Just to add to what you're saying, it really something that stood out to me while you were speaking was also the different ways in which we imagine or think that students are participating in digital spaces or on digital technology. Sort of, they often make choices, and I'm looking at like maybe social media like spaces where sometimes they are silent or silence for various reasons. They don't want to show up in digital spaces, or they make themselves invisible, but they are on these spaces. And I guess we associate a sort of doingness with being in digital. So we are constantly thinking of like these are the ways to engage in digital spaces has a certain doingness associated with it. Whereas I also think that just being a lot of students participate in these spaces in ways that we don't imagine.
Yeah, I think just like making assumptions about anything or generalizations, like I think both of those things, assuming and generalizing, just because a lot of youth use social media, not all youth use social media or have an interest in it. And so I think those are just like 2 key ideas, not making assumptions and not generalizing.
Silence. Some of the work I've been doing around TikTok and reading components in book talk, one of the things that came up that was really intriguing to me was a notion around the anonymous factor of being able to be in a space and experience it and experience the community components of these digital spaces, but then not have to have friends and family really know about those identities that they were exploring, and how being able to have that interaction and still, I guess, hide was really a powerful space for them to kind of have um, agency and autonomy that they didn't really feel that they had in spaces like school or spaces at home, or even spaces that are more public facing within social media spaces. So that's really making me think about that, Rabani, and also like the redefining components of literacy practices because of these spaces, and how like what it means to write. I'm thinking about your work, Dr. Hutchison, about what it means to write looks really different when you're getting access to be able to use a 3D printer, right? And composition looks really different than maybe what we're seeing in more traditional spaces as well, or even just what it means to read as well is redefined, right? Because of the sometimes the location of where we're engaging with that.
You're making me think of, and I'm going to pose a random theory, and I'm hoping that this falls apart. So please push on it. The when my first faculty position was at Colorado State in Fort Collins, and there's only I only have good things to say about that position. But one of the weird things for me was moving from Los Angeles to Fort Collins, was the small town nature of, if I were to go out to dinner, it's very likely I was going to run into a student and I'd be wearing, you know, like an obnoxious band t-shirt or something, and like not in like professor clothes, right? And so and I didn't feel that comfortable in the, and it's not rural, right? But I'll describe this as rural compared to Los Angeles. And part of what I love is, you know, tonight I will go to an obnoxious band concert, right, after my kids go to bed in Los Angeles, and I'm quite confident I will not see anybody I know there, and that is wonderful to me as a natural introvert. And so I kind of wonder if this idea of anonymity, and I think about kind of networked privacy in the way that Dana Boyd's talked about it, if there's a way that we might construct this idea of digital spaces as like a rural digital and a rural and a urban digital in some sense. And what I mean by that isn't in the kind of ways those words get taken up as class distinctions, but in terms of, if I go onto a social network like Be Real, it's very rural in that I will only see people I closely know based on the way that social network's constructed. And I can also go and lurk on TikTok and kind of fall into the urban space of not running into other people in those spaces. And so this is just a thing I've been reflecting on, the ways that we can kind of move across different kinds of spaces and be known or choose to not be known if we wanted to, or be known in different ways too.
That makes me think about the ways that sometimes spaces is navigated and negotiated, and the choices that individuals might make within those spaces. I think really speaks to not really assuming what we think a space really is, and why people are using it, to Rabani's point of, you know, why we might choose one particular social media space or one digital space or one digital action over another. So I love that kind of contrast of like the rural and urban within the digital kind of spaces, because I think that Dr. Garcia, that is true. Like we're using it for different purposes of who we get to see, and then also who do we get to express and be ourselves based on the kind of publicity of like where we are and how we're seen.
Because I primarily, well, often am working with elementary age students. I would say these are parts of, these are literacy skills that we should be teaching to our students very explicitly to help them understand the affordances and constraints of each of these spaces, like what they can be used for, what like the degree of privacy they have, how their data is being used. I think is like actually a really important thing that we have to explicitly teach students now, that like we didn't have to think about, you know, so many years ago. And I just think about the ethics of using various spaces, where your work shows up, not just being a critical consumer of other people's work, but actually being critical of your own work and the messages that you're conveying. If you're putting work out into a digital space, your voice out into a digital space, or participating in it, how are other people viewing it? Like, are you excluding other people in that space by the way you're talking about things, even if you might in no way imagine that you're doing that? Who are you excluding? And so just being even more critical of your own voice, in addition to being critical of the information you consume. And I think that's a shift that happens because we can be such ubiquitous creators now, or participators, however you want to think about it.
Coming back to this idea of like anonymity in online spaces, I've been doing some work lately with Grace Kim in Austin, and I just moved from Austin to a small town, and I'm experiencing much of what you were describing in Tarot. There's, I think, 7,000. The population here of non-students is 7,000 people, and like a 21,000 student population. So it's much the same experience. But thinking about how, like, I feel like in some online spaces, like the draw is the anonymity that you have. Like you're there because like you can have conversations anonymously that you might not want to have, or look up information that you might not want to in a clear way. And then in other spaces, there's, you want to be seen and recognized, and there's aspects of your identity or your beliefs or whatever that you don't in the space that's right around you have a connection to. And so like being seen is very important in those online communities. And I think one thing that's interesting is I think we all tend to think of ourselves, like our culture teaches us to think of ourselves as like very agentive and having a lot of control over who we are and the choices we make. But I think kind of thinking about, Amy, what you were saying, like as we're participating in these spaces, like looking at ourselves too, and like how is my participation in this and the different contextual factors in each space kind of maybe slowly, bit by bit, like day by day, minute by minute, like shaping who I am and who I'm becoming, or shaping the way that my beliefs are developing in ways that I'm not necessarily, or that none of us are necessarily choosing, but that are impacting us regardless. And I think that's a really hard, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, but it's just, it seems like a really hard thing to wrap my head around, or a hard conversation to have, because it is such a shift from the way we think about like identity and agency and choice and autonomy in our culture.
I'm going to sort of throw something in this that Dr. Garcia, what you and Dr. Nash, you just shared. So in my experience of working with youth, and not all of them, sort of my subset of people that are young people that I've been working with, they've often claimed that they're not active social media users. Though some of their conversations and their writings seem deeply informed by the networks that they're part of. So just thinking of anonymity, I think some of them are afraid of even putting themselves out. Maybe afraid is a wrong word, or they're in these spaces. They're choosing to be anonymous, not because that is something that they feel like they need to be in that space, but mostly because of where they come from, because of their social, cultural, religious backgrounds, economic backgrounds, where they've often said that they're stalkers, and we're not really on it. And some of that comes from sort of not having access to other things that maybe their peers have, or people in their school. So they choose to have these anonymous profiles and then see themselves as non-users, where they are users. They are actively engaged in these spaces, just not in the ways in which we understand. So I think just this framework of anonymity is so fascinating that it can be both. I mean, it is still agentive. Choosing to be anonymous for whatever reasons is still agentive.
Access makes me think. So just this morning, I was having trying to have a conversation with a potential doctoral student who's interested in the research that I do, wants to become a doctoral student. She's currently in Iran, and we started out trying to have a Zoom conversation, which we scheduled a few days ago. And she's like, actually, now Zoom has been shut down in our country. Can we talk via Google Meet? So we made a plan to contact each other via Google Meet. And then just last night, she emails again. She said, that's now shut down. We don't have access to that. Can we contact each other via Skype? And so we were able to successfully connect via Skype, but like with a very poor connection. And I just think about like some of the things that we worry about in the US in terms of equity and access for our students, which are incredibly important. But I think like we have such a filtered lens to view things in. Like this person literally had to fight for access to just have a video technology that she could use to connect about something that's like very important for her future. And I was in a school the other day where the students all had one-to-one iPads and laptops as part of like their daily repertoire of things. And so I think there's just a lot to unpack there and think about as we think about what are the real issues surrounding technologies as they relate to agency and ability to, I guess, just connect with the world.
So I think, Dr. Hutchison, you kind of were a perfect bridge to my question that I was going to ask the group. And how do you see some of the digital composition and also digital interpretation and multimodal semiotic interpretation really shaping teacher education, right? And what's happening as we're thinking about preparing future teachers to go into the classroom to do and engage in some of this work?
I think I learned like through COVID, having school age children at home for an entire year doing schooling, um, that we are, as a whole, teacher educators have not done a good job in preparing teachers for this. Or maybe that's not accurate to say. Maybe there's other systems at work. Maybe it has to do with, schooling and the nature of schools. But I feel like we have a really long way to go in terms of helping teachers think about digital composition, just even seeing modal composition as even a viable option, and thinking about like the critical ways that we think about technologies.
Kind of drawing on something, Amy, you were saying, I think for both K through 12 teachers and university educators and teacher educators, I think I'm of two minds, because on the one hand, I always want to think like we can all do better and we can all improve in our curriculum and pedagogy. And on the other hand, I think we're all trying to do work in systems. Like when we're trying to do good work, we're working in systems that are not necessarily set up for us to be able to do the kind of things that we want to do. But on a smaller and more optimistic note, I've been doing a lot of work with in-service teachers lately, and just starting to get into some of this with pre-service teachers, is just creating kind of inquiry spaces for them to look at digital literacies in the world and draw upon the things that they're seeing, and sort of starting with those inquiries and building from there has been on a much smaller scale something that I've found kind of cool and helpful, and I've been learning a lot from them. Coming back to like something Rabani was saying about access to digital technologies, just the other day, some of my students were talking about interactive fiction, and they pulled up this app, and it's an interactive fiction app where you make choices about how the story is going to progress. But if you want like the best choices for the story, you have to pay like an extra $2. And then, or you can pay like a longer subscription, and then you can like continually get access to the best choices. Right, which is something I hadn't really particularly thought about, is like how is storytelling, being infused with microtransactions or being monetized. So I think there's all kinds of cool things that can come up from that. But on a systemic level, I'm a little more pessimistic.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the nature of like the public schooling system in the US. It's just a very, it's very restrictive is my best word for it. My children actually, so I have a daughter with autism, so she goes to a private school here. And the sort of big sign that you see when you walk into the school office says school doesn't have to look the way you remember. And it's the most refreshing thing for me, because it doesn't at all for her. Like if I shared what her school day is like, she has very high functioning autism and she's able to work on grade level, but like not in any normal typical school way, and that they're able to make that work, right? And they're able to make it work in this setting. So why can't we make that work in other settings so that school fit students instead of students fitting schools. I think like that gives me hope that it's possible, but it's certainly not the system that we work within. So I do have to think, I think I have to think a lot, how do we work within the system that we have while also advocating to change it? And so one way I do that, to bring this back around to the digital, is like the work that I do. I think helping students think about literacies in these new ways, and how like the purposes for which they use literacy in some way like shapes their thinking as a future generation of users. So maybe someday school is not this restrictive place where students have to fit the school.
I guess yes to all of that. I think this is more of just an add-on than anything. You know, so much of, I think, my frustration with the ways multimodal interpretation and digital composition are being taken up in teacher education and in schools generally is that they end up just kind of like falling into the ways school has traditionally always worked, right? And I would say this is for the past, several generations of teachers at this point, right? That it kind of reflects kind of Larry Cuban's idea that the inflexibility of traditional schooling structure, that technology just kind of adheres and falls into place with it. That seems to me that we have these incredibly transformative tools, and generally, for the most part, except for kind of weird one-off cases, we end up just doing more of what school usually looks like. And again, this is feeling pessimistic. We don't tend to do something radically transformative. And in fact, I think the responses in the kind of media literacy responses to new forms of interaction in online spaces is to move to reactionary concerns around safety and privacy, and mainly make sure that students know how to not be harassed, not be bullied, not put explicit content on the internet. And those are important, but that's usually kind of where the line stops with most media literacy curriculum, is around either factuality or around safety, right? So it's safety and civility rather than around kind of innovation and transformation. And so I think that's been kind of a tension for me, is the kind of, what are we doing with these tools to some extent? And it doesn't have to be that way, but it doesn't have to be that way if we assume that we don't have to adhere to traditional state-sanctioned approaches to what schooling looks like.
A thought that kind of bubbled up as you were talking, something I've been concerned about lately too, is the ways that we're taking the way schools have always done things, like sort of in relation to like oppressive punishment behavior systems, and then shaping that, like using technologies to shape those in ways that make them even worse, through things like Class Dojo and what's that, like quiz app, but just sort of like instituting like very behaviorist kind of technologies, and then doing school in ways where a question that we're implicitly starting with is like, what is supported and allowed by this platform or by this technology, and then making curricular or pedagogical or behavioral decisions based on the technologies that are created by people who have nothing to do with our kids.
I guess I'd ask, what do you see as the antidote for that? Like, what could teachers do instead? Maybe you don't have that answer. Maybe that's not a fair question. I'm just curious if you have thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I think with all this stuff, I don't think I have, definitely don't think I have the answer. But I mean, I think coming back to like questions of teacher agency, like if a school is implementing like, a certain app or platform, I think that makes it more challenging for teachers. But I think just on the simplest and most basic level is being like cognizant of like the way that the technologies that we're bringing into classrooms aren't necessarily neutral, that they have their own rhetorics or their own like paths that they guide us towards, and then like thinking about like, is this what we want to be doing in our classroom, or are we doing this because like that's the way the point structure is set up within the platform? And I think we've had this, like these same issues have been around before with like learning management systems and grading systems, where like, there's certain things that are possible within, the electronic grade book that are, that are biased towards like certain ways of doing things. And, if you're like a 8th grade teacher, like you're, I think, somewhat limited in like your agency by whatever the social context of your school is. But I think at the very least, like doing some thinking around that, or, us working in university contexts, preparing teachers, like doing some teaching around that, I think is maybe not an answer, but a first step.
Yeah, it strikes me that the examples you gave are like students consuming technology. Those are ways that they're consumers, not in any way creators or producers of any products or services with technologies. And so I think like just those particular examples really demonstrate kind of like how this conversation started about some of the shifts that we need to make to help students directly create the technologies, or at least, you know, program what they would like to see instead of just deciding and just instead of just being forced to have to use what exists. And so I don't know how that connects back to Sarah's original question, but I just think like it sort of did bring it full circle to where I started.
Because our time is almost up, is I would love to hear a little bit about some of the joys of what the best things that you're experiencing right now within digital literacies or digital spaces. Because I know that there's a lot of heaviness sometimes when we think about some of the affordances and gatekeeping that takes place within some of these spaces in schooling. But I think that there also are ways of opportunities. I was hearing Dr. Hutchison kind of talk about some of the ways that we can kind of reframe or rethink. So personally, for me, one of the best things that I'm experiencing right now in digital spaces and digital literacies is Heidi Klum's worm costume for Halloween. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I'm just going to tell you, if you haven't, your life has been changed then, because it is something that's really giving me really renewed life. So I would love to hear some of the things that are just kind of bringing you that best thing that you're experiencing.
This is not like anything for me personally. It is in my research life, but so most of my work, I do focus on inclusive instruction, where like how do even students with disabilities participate in this? Because I do think actually students with disabilities are the group of students that are left out of sort of the digital movement more than anyone. Like they are most often asked to sit and consume and do like computer-based tutoring more than anything if they're ever allowed to touch a digital device. So I do that work, and a big win in my work has been working with teachers who have a lot of students with disabilities in their classrooms, and their actual shock that their students are able to learn to program and create things like that they just had no idea they could possibly do, but they were willing to try, and they did, and they are in awe that their students can do this. And so that's been a win to just work with so many teachers who sort of have had this like revelation in their thinking. So something positive I've seen recently.
I think one of the coolest things that I've started really thinking about and also seeing is just seeing the young people that I work with as sort of as knowledge producers, and also the ways that they position themselves as knowers of their context. And it's fascinating to watch it, and it's full of joy. It's super playful. They create all of these little spaces for themselves online, and they're constantly teaching. So they're saying we already know what we're doing, and I love thinking of them as agenting not because I did something or the digital media did something, but that they're using those spaces that are available, and they would do it even if the digital space wasn't.
I've got a few different options. I'm trying to decide like what the thing is that's giving me life in terms of the worm or not the worm. I guess I'll say the kind of bittersweet space, like headspace I've been in, and that is at the time that we're recording this, there's something of an exodus from Twitter for good kind of reasons, right? I think, you know, as Elon Musk has taken over, and I think during this conversation that my phone said that he's fired the ethical AI team for Twitter, which seems bad. I haven't read the details of that article, but that headline sounds bad. You know, I think, so there's two things. So one is it's kind of disheartening to think about abandoning that space, because yes, like it is whatever it is. And also all platforms are probably terrible to some extent, but I've spent a lot of time in communities there and gotten to know people in ways that I won't get to know them again and won't interact with them in a different space if and when I leave Twitter. And, you know, that's kind of a bummer, right? Like when we leave a community, as awful as big T Twitter can be, right? Like the small community of friends and colleagues I've come to know over the years, and people that I've only met on Twitter, and then we'll see each other for first time at a conference. Has been kind of a transformative space that I don't think other social networks are going to replace right away. So there's that. The other thing I'll just say is I've been playing with DALL-E 2, the kind of AI image-based thing, the AI we type in a prompt and it creates a picture for you, and it's terrifying and it's frightening, and I've been thinking about it. But kind of my favorite thing is I have 3-year-old twins, and the ability of that tool to just create any image they want is joyful for them. So my daughter will sit on my lap and say, I want a picture of an anteater eating a taco at the beach. And I can type anteater eating a taco at the beach, and it'll just create 4 images of anteaters eating tacos at the beach. And then usually it just kind of stays with the anteater eating something. So no, I want anteater eating a cupcake at another place, right? So lots of anteater pictures from DALL-E. So I get maybe that's a useful form of composition that's happening.
So I'll share 2 things that I think have been really joyful for me over the last couple of years. One is just the middle school English teachers who I've been working with, and the extent their like hunger and their excitement and the amazing things that they're doing when given even just a little bit of agency and space to do amazing things, and sort of subsequently their students, when they're creating ones in which like students have a chance to talk about, the like emotional manipulation on Twitter or clickbait and things, like how thoughtful the students are about these things, and just how lively those classrooms are is really exciting. And feeling like in the midst of a lot of pessimism, just seeing people come to life with like excitement and criticality around these topics has been really great. And then on a more personal level, I feel like whenever I'm too bummed out about this, I'll go back and play I think it was a Sony video game from about 10 years ago called Journey, that is just really alive and wonderful, and it's very short, like so easy to get into. And I think it reminds me of like some of the beautiful possibilities that can come from like digital art, and that's funny, Antero, that can come from like our experiences with technologies on more aesthetic levels that I think I and maybe a lot of us focus less on, given all of the terrible things happening in the world today, that like there still are beautiful possibilities like through and outside of technologies that I think we would be amiss if we were to forget those.
I'll quickly share one playful thing that has been going on at my house because it was pretty funny and kind of fun for me. My children like really passionately wanted to deliver Halloween candy at our house through a robot. And they like independently brainstormed all the possible ways that they could do this and like the things they could build. And so I ended up having to like help them out because the things they were trying to build were not successful, but like I really appreciated their process and let them go at it for a while. So we ended up finding a robotic arm kit, and they built a robotic arm. I mean, mind you, this is like an 8-year-old doing this, and like persevered in the written instructions for like insane numbers of hours to build this robotic arm, because they were so motivated to want to drop candy into a bucket with it. And ended up like my 8-year-old decided she wanted to document the process and took pictures and made her own slideshow. And like I directed none of this. This was like their independent choice to document and do all of these things, but I just like marveled at the literacy that was taking place and all of this, and the joy, and like how independently they did this, and just the thrill that they had on Halloween night, like using the robotic arm to give people candy. And so I think like that's aspirational for what we can do with technologies.
That is so cool. I just want to say that like the audio recording won't. Oh, my dogs are barking, but it doesn't capture the kind of joy that I saw people's faces react to how cool that project is, and you don't capture the audio. It just sounds like you're saying this and everyone's just flat. But I think that's really cool.
On that note, thank you all so much for your time. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I think it has gone in so many different directions, but I think it has really touched on some of the future components of where digital literacies will be going in the future for the field. So thank you.